A long time ago, a young man not too far from here in Walnut Grove, Missouri, had come to the conclusion that the only way out was to end his story early. He was a young father. He had two young daughters at home, and his wife had just had their third child. And the economy of their household was not very sustainable. He had actually just recently run over a squirrel on purpose to feed his family. He started spiraling into a pit of depression, especially after his son was born, because, as most new fathers, it was an incredible challenge to have children and not be able to provide for them. But there was a deeper issue. He had been a student at Baptist Bible College, but he quit. He got disillusioned by ministry. He got disillusioned by the politics of it all. And he said to himself, I might be a lot of things, but I will never, ever be a preacher. But ignoring the call of God does not make it go away. And as a result, he spiraled even deeper and deeper into depression. He thought maybe if he could just get out of town and go to work somewhere, that he could maybe forget about the whole calling thing. So he moved his family to Walnut Grove and began working for a farmer. But things didn't get any better. He hoped God would forget about him, honestly. And then one day, in the deep, dark depression and chapter of his life, this young man began to hear the whispers of Satan. You're over. You're worth nothing. Nothing will ever get any better. So he drove his truck off into that farm, into a big open field, and found a large oak tree. He parked his truck under the oak tree. He sat there in silence, opened the glove compartment, took out a handgun, pointed it to his head, asked God to forgive him, and he pulled the trigger. I don't know what chapter you may be in your ministry or your life right now. I don't know if it's quite that dark, but there are some of you here that are hurting. There are some of you here that are in a chapter of your life where it seems like there is no light and there is no reason for continuing on. It may not be pulling the trigger of a gun, but it may be pulling the trigger on a career and saying it's over. Pastors especially experience depression at such a high rate, and for many different reasons. It could be a business meeting that went wrong. It could be a decision of a staff member or a deacon board. It could be a lot of things that cause you to be in a chapter of your life where you may not be considering ending your own life, but you might be considering throwing it all away. But before you do, I want to remind you of three truths about your story. The first truth is that God is the author of your story. Now, we say amen to that, and I think we would all agree. But if you're like me, a lot of times I want to be his ghostwriter. Yeah, he's the author, but I'll be the editor. Because if we're truly honest and we look at our lives and we look at all the chapters that we've lived, there are many of those chapters that are very disinteresting, bleak, almost embarrassing. So we would love to rewrite some of what God is writing, but never forget that he is the author. As a matter of fact, we're reminded in Scripture in Philippians chapter 1 and verse number 6, we read that God has started your story and he will finish it. Being confident of this very thing, that he who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Now, that means your life is not a random collection of accidents. Your life is just not a series of events with no meaning. It's not a story out of God's control. Somewhere along the way, God just left writing your story in the middle. No, He started it, He will finish it. He started it, and He is still writing, regardless of how deep or dark your chapter is right now in your ministry, in your personal life. God is still writing. He's not walking away from it halfway through. But here's the thing, we don't really like a lot of the chapters because they don't look impressive. As a matter of fact, there's biblical examples of this. I mean, just think about the life of Joseph. I mean, his brother sold him into slavery. That's not a really good chapter. He was sold to the household of Potiphar, and there he worked, and for a moment there was a glimpse of wonderful things. The chapter started to turn around, but then Potiphar's wife came on to him. He runs away. She falsely accuses him, and he winds up in prison. That's not a chapter that's very impressive. As a matter of fact, it might be something you wouldn't want anyone to read. Moses. I mean, good night. How many chapters of Moses' life did he spend in the wilderness? Not very impressive, just walking around in circles. Let's edit that one. Or Elijah under the tree. Nate brought a great message yesterday morning on that. I mean, that wasn't a very impressive chapter. Pretty embarrassing, actually, if you think about all that went on. If you walked into those moments without context, you would say, wow, God is really doing something great here. No, we'd be like, what? That's a failure. That looks like delay. That looks like it's all falling apart. None of those chapters look like success stories, but God kept writing. And you know what? He didn't abandon Joseph in prison. He didn't forget Moses in the wilderness. And he didn't walk away from Elijah under that tree. And he hasn't walked away from you either. I have seen that firsthand. I've seen unimpressive chapters that you would think God's nowhere to be found. I've seen God do amazing things after those unimpressive chapters. I've seen Him work in villages without electricity or running water. I've seen Him work in church plants that started under a mango tree. I have literally seen those things happen. In places where if you were to go and ask a sensible person what's going to happen next, they would probably say, well, probably not much. Because it's just so unimpressive. Places where the setting didn't look promising, the resources weren't there, and hey, there wasn't a bunch of people either. And yet God shows up because He doesn't build with perfect materials. He builds with the ones that are available. He's writing your chapter. He's not looking for polish. He's not looking for you to impress anybody. He's not looking for people who already look like the finished product. He's looking for people who are willing to stay on the page while He keeps writing. So wherever you are, and I know I'm talking to some of you that are at the end of your rope, you feel like it's over. And I want to encourage you. You're not the author, God is, and He is still writing. If God only used polished people, we would all be in the lobby right now saying, wow, that was a short service. And because God is the author and He is still writing, here's the second truth. No single chapter defines you. The enemy loves early endings. That's what he did to that young man in that field that day, convinced him it's time for an early ending. I'm sure if the devil had his way, he would have frozen Peter's story right after the cock crowed, right after the rooster crowed. I'm sure if he could have, he would have frozen Thomas's story right after he had doubted the resurrected Lord. I'm sure that he would have probably said, you know what? Just frees David's story right after he commits adultery and then sends her husband into battle to die. Satan would have loved to freeze their stories there. And in those kind of dark chapters, Satan whispers, that's it. That's who you are. That's how this all ends. But that is a lie. And if you stay in ministry long enough, you'll have a chapter that you wish nobody will ever read. I've had plenty. I had one, it never made the newsletter. I had many that never made the newsletter. You know, missionaries, we don't put those in the newsletter. I'll just be honest with you. Well, this one that I'm about to tell you did not make the newsletter. I was embarrassed by it, and I realized that it was embarrassing for me at the moment, but now I have realized it's one of the most motivating, powerful chapters in my life as a missionary. My wife and I started our first church plant right as soon as we moved to Esteli, Nicaragua in the summer of 2017. We just started by meeting people. We started talking to people. We had just gotten fresh out of language school, so really greetings were right up my alley. I wasn't too good in the language yet. My best school has been the streets of Nicaragua, and we just started learning people's names and inviting them over to our house for coffee and cookies, and we would tell them we're here to church, start a church, and they would turn their heads at us like, what? And then we say, we're going to have you over for people people who are interested meeting. And they'd say, what? And we said, we're going to have coffee and cookies. Okay, we'll come. And so we started having groups of people join. We formed a launch team and we launched our church. Our first preview service, we had 44 people show up. And I still, man, my Spanish was so horrible. But I preached and people got saved and it was just exciting. That made the newsletter. Right? So we had our next month's preview service in April. It went well, had about 50 people there. And then the next month rolls around and we're ready, or we were going to be doing our next launch service or preview service in May, but something happened in April. Some of you may know in 2018. And just to make a really short story, when you get tear gas in your own home, you know it's time probably to leave for a little while. And so we did. For a couple of months. Then we got back on August 1st and had to restart. But we had all these contacts. So Jennifer and I, that first week, we found another place to rent. We had started in our home. And guess what? The house right next to us, we actually shared a wall. We rented it. And so we thought we're going to rent this, set it up as a church. We went out that week and visited about 50 people. It was a little hard because they still had their doors shut. They weren't outside. They were scared still of what had just happened, but we knocked, and once they saw who we were, they let us in. We told them we're starting again. It's going to be right here. It's only been a couple of months. We told them it's right next to our house. They all seemed very excited. And so we got excited, and we took all the chairs over there to that house. Jennifer and I cleaned this house up. We put 50 chairs out and moved the little sound system I had over there, and I prepared all week my sermon and the music because I was doing it all right. I had to make the PowerPoints for the songs and download the songs and get them ready to play on a computer. We didn't have instruments, but we had 44 people. We had 50 people, and we were excited to see what God would do next when this new chapter. And so 10 o'clock Sunday morning, it's time, right? We get over there early. Jennifer makes the coffee. She had made about 4 dozen cupcakes because we were just expecting it to be awesome. 10 o'clock rolls around and nobody's there. Just Jennifer and I. Now that's not unusual in that culture. You know, you tell somebody when something starts, that's when they start getting ready and then leave their house in Nicaragua about 20 minutes later. So we said, no big deal. We just looked at each other. Well, wait, we had the music playing, the doors open wide, and 15 minutes go by, still nobody, but no big deal. That's not uncommon. 30 minutes goes by, and I look at Jennifer and I said, we told them the right day, right? She's like, yeah, we'll wait a little longer. And so we waited, 45 minutes goes by, nobody. An hour goes by, nobody. Then my wife had a harebrained idea. Let's take a selfie. And here it is. She'll show that photo, you'll see the day no one showed up. You can tell on our faces. She was a little more humorous. I was a little more perturbed. But right after we took that picture, I said, Jennifer, let's go home. She said, no, I don't want to go home. Let's get the microphones and sing the songs. I said, seriously? Like last night, right? Seriously? Great message, by the way. She said, yeah, we'll sing loud enough. Maybe somebody off the street will walk in. So, well, what did we do? We did what Jennifer wanted. We got the mics and we sang. And I had to move the little thing on the computer myself because we're singing and I don't know the words. I mean, the song's in Spanish, man. Come on. So I'm going, well, they were singing our hearts out, and we sing through all three songs and nobody. I said, okay, let's go. Let's go. I'm done. She said, no, I heard you practicing all week. I want to hear you preach. So I preached to Jennifer. I still remember she was on the second row. We left a little aisle, second row, right there in the middle. And I preached. And she got saved. No, I'm just kidding. No, I preached. And I had practiced. You have to understand, when I started in Spanish, literally, I would preach my sermons at least 10 times out loud just so I could get my tongue loosened up to say the words right, right? And so, yeah, I preached and I got to the conclusion, and I'm about to start the conclusion, and I see a shadow at the door. And I look over, and our across the street neighbor, Mercedes, is standing in the door. So I stopped and said, oh, hi, Mercedes. Of course, hola, Mercedes. Pase adelante. And come on in. And Jennifer got up. We both hugged her. She sat down by Jennifer. And then I whispered to Jennifer in English, I want to start over. And she goes, so I preached the whole thing. Preached it all again. Got to the conclusion, got to the invitation, and Mercedes got saved. Now listen carefully. That moment could have been a chapter that defined my story in a completely different way if I had not listened to my wife. So that's the lesson, man. Always listen to your wife. No, but seriously, because she encouraged me to stay on the page while God was continuing to write the chapter. That moment did define my ministry up to this point, but in a very, very positive way. The moment could have been used to define everything like, "Ugh, nothing's working." If I'd have gone home and not preached that day, I would have said, no one's coming. This isn't working. It's over. But that's exactly why this truth matters. No single chapter defines you. Because what looked like a failure in the moment was actually God writing something I could not see yet. And thanks to my wife, I didn't allow the chapter to end before we saw Mercedes accept Christ. If I had quit in that empty room chapter, I would have missed what God was going to be doing in the very next one. So, if God is the author of your story, and He is, and no single chapter defines you, then that brings us to the third and last truth. The conclusion of your story matters more than the start. You know, I've reached the age where I don't just think about starting anymore, although I love starts. All my life, I've enjoyed starting new things. As a pastor for 23 years, I was an early adopter to new things and new strategies and new technologies. And I love starting new things. I mean, I can remember starting the second service, and then I can remember starting the Saturday night service because we ran out of parking. I can remember loving to do all those things. As a missionary, I love starting churches. We've started 4 now, and I've got a whole lot more to start. But I have to be honest with myself at the same point and say, I also, at this point in my life, have to think about the finish as well. Not anytime soon. I've got a lot of starting left in me. But I am 58, not 28, if you get my drift. So, yes, you reach a point in your ministry where you realize that the conclusion actually matters more than the start. Instead of just thinking about starting, I think about finishing too. I'm not foolish enough to believe I can do this forever. You know, my 84-year-old mother, just not too long ago, said, Max, I'm getting so old. And I said, Oh, mama. And I grabbed her. I said, No, you're not. You're not getting old. You are old. And after she slapped me, I said, I'm getting old. You are old. And then I ran. Um, you know, I can tease my mama that way, and she's probably going to watch this. I love you, mama. But when I am old, I don't want to just live on the early chapters that have already been written. I don't want to become one of those men who just talks about what God used to do. I don't want to live on old stories. I want the final chapters of my life to say something good about the faithfulness of God. And I've learned this: the end of your story is not determined by how strong you started, but by how faithful you remained. Let me say something to you younger men and women here tonight. A piece of advice that an older pastor gave me. I was 17 years old, and I don't know why he took an interest in me, but he pulled me to the side and said, Max, I want to share some wisdom with you and a principle of success that you need to implement into your life. And I said, Yes, sir. What is that? And he said, I want you to start saying yes first for experience sake. At that moment, I didn't quite understand what that meant, but then he explained it this way. And I'm explaining it to you that are maybe at an early chapter in your life, young men, young women here tonight. When God affords you an opportunity to do something that you do not feel ready to do, say yes first. He explained that when you say yes, even though you're not ready, guess what will happen? You will get ready. Nothing prepares you more than the commitment of stepping out by faith and saying yes before you understand or you feel ready. You say, I don't feel ready. You're not. None of us are. I never was. I graduated in 1991 from this wonderful school. It was Baptist Bible College, Mission University. It was wonderful. Greatest learning time of my life. Graduated in 1991, and before I graduated in that May, in April, I was called as the lead pastor of a church in Lubbock, Texas. I have no idea what they were thinking. I was 23. I was not ready, but I said yes. Most of the chapters I'm grateful for today started with a yes I didn't feel ready to give. Moving to Nicaragua after 23 years of pastoring, 3 adult kids, 11 grandkids, 14 great grandkids. No, I'm just kidding. Not that old. But I do have 11 grandkids. I mean, we were having grandkids. My kids were having them like rabbits. They were coming out every 9 months for a while there. And during that is when God calls you to another country. I didn't feel ready, but I said yes. I still walk into situations daily almost that I feel unqualified, but I'm determined to still say yes. If you're waiting to feel ready, you're going to be waiting a long time because you're not ready. That's why it requires faith. Now, Some of you are tired. You're not the young guy you used to be, but don't let the weariness make decisions only faith should make for you. Some of you have been doing this a long time. Don't drift into spiritual nostalgia and call it wisdom. God is still writing. Now, let me take you back to that field in Walnut Grove, Missouri. When that young father pulled the trigger, all he heard was a click. The gun miraculously failed to fire. It shocked him, and he panicked. And with his hands shaking uncontrollably, he gently sat that gun on the dash, and it immediately fired and blew out the windshield. He was paralyzed with fear. He realized what he had almost done. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, he prayed, really prayed, not a polished prayer, but a desperate one. He said, God, I know I'm not living the life you have planned for me. I'm a failure. I don't know what kind of dad I'll be to my son, but he's going to need you. I give you my boy. He's yours. Call him into the ministry. Let him become what I never will. And that young man, 13 years later, eventually did become a pastor. He pastored faithfully for the rest of his life, and God used his story to influence hundreds, even thousands for the cause of Christ. His story did not end in that field. Praise the Lord. But what about his son? Well, that story's still being written. That young man was my dad. He told me that story a couple of months before he died. I never knew that his story almost ended. And I almost never knew my dad. But because of a miracle of God, I stand before you tonight to tell you again, don't miss this. God is the author of your story. No single chapter defines you, and the conclusion matters more than the start. So, whatever chapter you're in tonight, don't let despair ever hold the pen. Don't let the enemy ever narrate your life to you. Maybe you're living in a dark chapter right now. Maybe this chapter of your life today is disappointing. It's bleak, it's embarrassing. But just because a chapter is hard doesn't mean it's bad. Because I have learned this, some of God's best writing happens right after the moment you thought it was over. Only God knows how your story will end. But if you are still breathing, He's still writing. And your best chapter may still be ahead. And my prayer for you is that the rest of your story be the best of your story.